is also worship. We want to know God. We want to know His way. We want to understand His words. And a lot of His words strike us as mysterious, and we don't always understand them right. We misunderstand them a lot of times. So that is why the study is an act of worship. It's an act of knowing God and understanding who He really is and what He is really like. And His words are good enough and worthy enough to be understood with precision. So study is the only way you get there. There's no shortcuts. I know some people say, oh, God's just going to tell me everything. He's going to supernaturally reveal everything to me. And in that case, we don't need universities, right? And books also are not necessary. So all that library, just get rid of it, because God's going to reveal everything to us supernaturally. Fine, that's okay. God does speak to us. But most of the time it has to do with what's going on inside of our hearts, inside our souls, in our inner beings, because that's what we need to hear. But as far as it comes to study, academic things, research, inquiries, that's where we we need some help. And that's a very purposeful thing we do. So, to bring us up to speed, we have been considering Essenes for a little while. We've been studying Jewish diversity of the Second Temple era, particularly around the first century. And we have been looking at all these different ideological movements of the first century CE, and so Essenes is where we stopped, and that's where we're continuing. It is currently believed that the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you heard about, were somehow connected to the Essenes. That is the current belief, a hypothesis that we have. And that a settlement that I showed you right here on the edge of this wadi, very near to where the scrolls were found, was inhabited by the Essenes. This is what people believe. At least one sect of the Essenes, at least one group. So some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are clearly internal documents. And they're documents of the Jews who lived there because they have the rules and the customs that other Jews of that era did not practice and did not live by. So we realize we have some really unique material that comes from those caves. And the hypothesis and the theory is that these are the rules of the Essenes. We're coming upon their library, their unique worship materials. So that's what's interesting to us. So now we have a little bit of a window into an ancient life, because I'll be honest with you, not a lot of documents from that era were preserved so well. So we have some interesting things. So I want to begin by drawing some parallels for you in this session. The book of Acts describes first century followers of Yeshua, and he lived in a way that is hard for many of us modern believers to imagine. We read what seems like to us on the pages of the book of Acts, this utopian society, people who possess things in common, basically enabling the elimination of poverty and need altogether. It sounds absolutely amazing. The way they lived. Like we're reading this and we want to be there. We want to be a part of that type of a community. Their lifestyle represented really the ultimate expression of what I call the Jewish concept of Ahavat Israel. They simply loved each other. They loved Israel. Israelites who express love to each other in an unconditional way. And that's what the Jewish followers of Jesus practiced in the first century towards one another. That is why we are so drawn to those passages, because that expression of love is so pure. Now, on what basis did these believers conduct their lives this way is the question we must ask. The Torah taught all kinds of principles, and it emphasizes the care for the poor, obviously, and the needy. That's right there. Many times, a good place is Leviticus 23 that tells us to care for the needy. It does not speak of sharing our resources to the extent of having all poverty and all property, essentially, I'm saying, to the extent of having all property in common. Torah does not tell us sell everything and just share everything. It doesn't quite go that far. It does say share. So on the contrary, if we read Torah carefully, it seems to indicate this God-given right to private property. There's lots of laws in the Torah that govern private property. So don't think for a second that Torah somehow negates private property. That's not it. Israel's prophets did not call for this either. Israel's prophets said, care for the poor, take care of the widows, orphans. But nowhere do we have a universal call by the prophets where people are supposed to sell everything and just eliminate poverty in society altogether in one swoop. That didn't happen. And only one time, as we read in the Gospels, Yeshua told a wealthy person to sell everything, give it all away to the poor, and follow him. Remember that in Matthew? That's only one time. It was never a teaching directed at everyone. It was a statement given to one rich person for whom his resources were really a stumbling block to becoming a disciple. So Yeshua challenged them in the way that he needed to be challenged. That doesn't extend to every single one of us, we understand. So, according to Josephus, the Essenes practiced just this kind of lifestyle. So this is from Flavius Josephus from Wars of the Jews, chapter 2, and he writes this. One cannot find a person among them, meaning the Essenes, who has more than another in terms of possessions. Those entering the community must yield up their funds to the other. The assets of each one have been mixed in together as if they were brothers to create one fund for all. Sound familiar? Very familiar. That is actually what we see in the book of Acts.
In fact, I do know the Pilgrims, when they first came here, they tried to implement this. Yeah. It did not work because many of them stopped farming and this and that. They were just lazing around.
Right.
And so they had to get together and restructure and realize
if other people farm for me, I might as well kick back and relax.
Right, that's what
right. Smoke my pipe, enjoy my days, because somebody else is going to do the hard work, right? And I'm just going to reap the fruits of their labor. Yeah, see, this is why socialism doesn't work. It only works if you're a selfless person. But deep inside, we are selfish. So it's a problem. But the difference in the community of Essenes, as I want you to note right here, is that you must yield your funds to the order. You don't have a choice. This is not voluntary. And they all become intermixed with everybody else's property. Now, in the book of Acts, you don't see that. There's no must in the book of Acts. People bring their resources willingly and lay them at the feet of the apostles. But it's never a must. It's not something that you have to do in order to be a follower of Messiah in that time in Jerusalem. That's not how they did it.
I was thinking of Ananias and Sapphira because they didn't have to do,
right,
but they vowed to do, or they said they would do, right, and then they held back. So it's a little bit of both. It's like if you make a vow, you have to keep it.
Right.
God, it wasn't that God was judging them for not giving all.
Right.
It was that they said they did that, but they didn't.
It's for deception. It's for deception. So you remember the words of Peter, and we basically told him, it says, you didn't have to do this. Right. You did this willingly. Why did you hold back? Why did you deceive? And so, yes, that judgment came upon them. And that's a great story that illustrates that in that community, giving of your resources was something voluntary, not mandatory. And the Essene community, you wanted to join the order, it was absolute and mandatory. In fact, they had very strict membership rules that we can read about. So, is it possible that some of the Essenes decided to follow Yeshua? Is the question that I always ask, and some others ask as well. Now, if they did, it would not likely change their lifestyle drastically. Think about it. If they embrace that Yeshua is the promised Messiah, perhaps, if they did, they're not going to just stop doing what they've been doing for all this time. So even those who had no association with the Essenes could actually see how such a system worked. Why? Because it worked. It wasn't designed to work forever. It was designed to work for time. And if the entire world was about to undergo a Messianic era transformation, then that lifestyle made sense, because this is a temporary solution to something great that's coming. So that's how they saw it, I believe, and that's why the community in Acts acted the way they did. Now, this may be going beyond what the Torah requires, because Torah does not say sell everything and give it all to the poor. It doesn't talk about eliminating poverty altogether. Yes, they are sharing, economic sharing that goes on, but we're not talking about Torah espousing socialist ideals. So that's just not there. The focus on the well-being of everyone at the expense of personal stability is a virtue, but that's not what people are being mandated to do. It is a choice that they were making. And the Essenes apparently lived that way. So it's not surprising that people may see similarities between the Essenes and the early followers of Jesus in Jerusalem. I want you to consider a few matters, a few ideas where I see a great amount of overlap. So the Essene order was led by priests. Did you know that? We've talked about this. They were from Zadok, Zadokite priests. The book of Hebrews casts Jesus as the ultimate priest of the order of Melchizedek. That's how some people saw him. They saw him in that priestly role. Now, during his Last Supper, Jesus acted as the priest described in 1QS. If you remember, I read to you 1QS, how it stayed down in silence, and the priest makes the benediction, and he passes all the food to everyone who's there, and only after he said the words and gave the food to specific people, he actually hands this out. Then they eat all together, and after that, they enjoy a discourse together, and they eat and they drink and they discuss Torah and the teachings that they want to remember that day. That is exactly what he does. Like if you read the Qumran, 1QS, and then compare it with the gospel narrative of what's happening in the upper room, you can say, wait a minute, this is like exactly the same scene if you were to visualize it and imagine what's going on. So sometimes people make these connections and they say, well, that looks awfully like the behavior of the Essenes. Now, Essenes placed low priority on material possessions and pooled their resources, as we said, and they practiced open benevolence. They were very much into helping those who did not have anything. Why? Because that is the holy work, right? That is what the prophets called us to do, to lift up the poor from the ashes. So these same values are strongly reflected in Yeshua's teachings about giving and lending freely when you're able to. Just think of all the teachings that Yeshua talked about of giving to the poor, of lifting people up from the lowest points of society, of elevating people and people who are considered nothing and absolutely unimportant, marginalized people, okay? Women of ill repute, lepers, people like that will be uplifted and given charity and love and even fellowship of a rabbi, okay? At this, other Jews looked and said that does not work. This is not how we do. We associate with people of our kind. But Yeshua's mission was to lift people up from a lower status and bring them closer to himself, elevate them. And so Essenes have that same quality. They will take somebody from the bottom layer of society and try to elevate them. So just like the Essenes did not carry many provisions with them on a journey, and we read some passages about that, they relied upon coming into one of the outposts, one of the houses that's owned by other Essene community, and having everything provided for them. They didn't travel loaded down with property because actually they didn't own that property. Because they know where they're going, there's going to be another house, and there's going to be all the things that they need in that house that they need to use. So they traveled light, and by the way, Yeshua told his disciples to depend on the hospitality of people as they preach the gospel. Same exact situation. He says, come into the house, and whatever they feed you is what they feed you. Where they put you to sleep is where they put you to sleep. Rely on their hospitality. That's what he told them. Do not pack all the stuff to go on the journey with you. Allow for people to minister to you by giving those things. So they were told not to pack extra. And even his teaching of not caring for food or clothing, but trusting God. Remember that one? Do not care. He says basically, don't worry about these things. Now, this type of teaching would appeal to the Essenes on such a high level. Why? Because they put such a low priority on things like food and clothing. I mean, I realize this is actually quite countercultural. I don't know if you realize this or not, but a lot of people in that era, most of their life was rotating around procuring food, manufacturing food, producing food, processing food, somehow acquiring food, and then eating that food. They spent so much of their life just completely busied with that simple task that you and I take for granted because we go to the grocery store and buy everything we need. And it's all nicely packaged for us. Well, they didn't have that. So people constantly thought about where their next meal comes from. Because if they didn't prepare it, it wasn't going to be there. So Yeshua places such a low priority on food and clothing. He says, don't worry about these things. They will happen. If God supplies the animals with what they need, he'll supply you. And you'll see this same type of idea carried over in rabbinic theology as well. But the Essenes, they would have heard those words and they would have been just like, oil poured upon them. They would have loved that kind of teaching. So some among early Christ followers donated significant means to the communal needs. We've talked about that, which of course the Essenes saw as a mandatory requirement. So we mentioned Ananias and Sapphira and their large donation. Okay, so that's something that people did, and the Essenes did that as well. In fact, they required it, as we read. Now, each Essene group and settlement had a caretaker who distributed the communal resources, whether for the needs of the group or to aid the needy strangers. This is what happened quite often. And early followers of Yeshua did the same. They had some communal needs, and some of those communal needs were taken care of from communal property, which people donated to the group, essentially. So if Ananias and Sapphira gave all of their possessions and their fields and their property, that would have been converted and used to feed people, to clothe people, to care for them. So we read in Acts, for example, how the community fed many widows and designated trusted men of the community to dispense the resources to the needy. We read about that. Acts 6 describes how Stephen was chosen for this very task. He's basically is a custodian of public funds that are given to the community. His job is to pass it on to the people who really need it. He's the interface, okay, between people who need it and the funds that they have available to help them out. This is what the Essenes did. They traveled light because they knew they would come to a house, that in this city there's a house that belongs to their group, and they have a place to sleep and food to eat, and they don't have to worry about it. So you could see so many overlaps and similarities between what we read in Acts and what we experience as we read the descriptions of how the Essenes lived and their order functioned. And no wonder people try to make those connections, that there's such a resemblance between these communities. One of the key Essene institutions were daily communal meals with an attitude of holiness as they ate in God's presence. They believed that God ate with them as they dined. They always encouraged each other and talked about Torah at meals, taking turns to speak. Does that sound familiar at all? Because as we read, the followers of Yeshua did something very similar. They also assembled for meals, not daily, because they didn't have a commune in which they all lived and worked. But they would assemble at least once a week or so in the atmosphere of holiness. They would also pool their resources. They made sure that everyone had enough to eat, make sure that people that didn't have anything would get something. And they also engaged in talks about the scriptures, taking turns to encourage each other. If that doesn't sound familiar, read Acts chapter 2, verse 42 and verses 46. You will see that. That's exactly what's happening there. So you have an institution of the Essenes that seems to be a very central one around which their life rotates. And then you have the institution of the early followers of Yeshua. That is almost the same. So I don't blame people who kind of try to make links between these communities. And then there's more. There's more. I want you to think about the idea of the new covenant. And the idea of the new covenant in Brit Chadashah, we even call this entire corpus of apostolic writings, Brit Chadashah. I don't necessarily like it per se, but it's a traditional name for it. The concept of the new covenant, I want you to consider, and consider the language that comes from these Christ followers and the Essenes. So this is from 1 Corinthians. This is from Shaul. He's talking about the cup. He says, the cup is the new covenant in my blood. He's quoting Yeshua. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. A very central verse, right? Everyone knows this one. And then Paul also wrote in 2 Corinthians, he describes himself and other people, and he says, who also made us, and he's talking about himself and others, as adequate as servants of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. So being part of a new covenant community, entering into a new covenant, being servants of the new covenant, actually means something, right? And it doesn't mean that it has anything to do with the books, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and It has to do with actual covenant, right? And that covenant is described on the pages of the Tanakh. So we are kind of getting the idea that we know what they mean. I mean, how people choose to explain these words today may be a little bit different. Maybe they've taken a slightly different train in a different direction. But I think you get the idea that these discussions about the new covenant really stem back to Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And then as the New Testament uses this language of new covenant, they understand it that Messiah ushered in a new era with his resurrection. And they call that era of the new covenant, Brit Chadashah, right? This is a new moment in Israel's history. It's the era of new type of faithfulness. It's the era of new radical commitment to love, benevolence, and support of Messiah's community. If you think about it, they're living the new covenant. Why do they pool all their money together? Why do they sell all this stuff and decide to help each other in such a way? Because they want to live the reality of the promised new covenant. If they believe that this era has now come, then they have to now live it. And that's what they do. They actually start living what they were hoping for. They were hoping that this is it, this is the moment. Now, the Essenes Damascus document does actually quite similar. So there's a document that the Essenes, that was basically dubbed Damascus document because it keeps talking about Damascus. And it's not about Damascus, honestly. The word Damascus is a code word, as many things that Essenes do. They don't always mean what they say. They're code words. Damascus is a code word. So this is the Damascus document, usually abbreviated as CD. They write in this document, and to observe the Sabbath according to its true meaning, and the feasts, and the day of the fast according to the utterances of them who entered into the new covenant in the land of Damascus. They actually believe that there are some people who have entered in a new covenant in the land of Damascus. Now, Damascus basically means outside of Jerusalem, okay? Because remember, they went outside of Jerusalem because they were protesting Jerusalem. So they left. As I said, it's just a code word for being outsiders. So they continue to contribute their holy things according to the true interpretation. Holy things that when they're talking about is their resources, the things that they give to the Lord, the things that they dedicate to God. We read through Bamidbar and Leviticus, Numbers, people dedicate things holy to the Lord. Today, partially that we were reading, talked about dedicating things to the Lord, giving them to the priests, and they belong to the priests. So the same thing, to contribute their holy things according to the true interpretation. Whatever that true interpretation is, I'm sure they have it in mind. To love everyone his brother as himself. Sounds familiar? And to strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy and the stranger, and to seek everyone the peace of his brother. Are you down with this kind of sermon? Because that sounds like something Yeshua would preach, right?
Sorry, I'm not sure if you explained it, but what would they have understood that new covenant to mean? Like that verbiage of...
The verbiage of the new covenant has for the Essenes, and I believe for the community in the book of Acts, would have been an era. This is a new stage in development of Israel, in the maturity of Israel. There are different eras. And as you enter, prophets promise that at one point Israel would enter into this moment that they called the era of the new covenant. And things start to shift and change in society, right? So if you read promises like Jeremiah, it talks about eradicating sin, for example, altogether, and to bring in righteousness in a way that it has never come before. And people not even having to teach each other about God because everybody knows God, because everybody walks with God. You don't have to basically set sinners straight because people are already living holy lives, because the very environment in which they're immersed does not allow for anything else but that kind of life. So how do you do that? You have to start living it and hope that that type of life, that way of living, would infect everyone else around you. Because if you start doing it and other people join it and other people join it, you basically create a movement that spreads. And if people actually believe it and they do it, then hypothetically, you can have a societal-wide change. And that's the idea of the new covenant. It's a moment of maturity, essentially. I mean, that's what we're talking about.
You could almost maybe, on a certain level, it seems to contradict if you look at the idea of a contract and the idea of a new dispensation or a period of time. But in reality, I mean, I look at maybe the lease to a house, right? You're moving to a new house, you sign a new lease. In a sense, it's both, right? It's a new period of time, new place, but it's also a new contract given, it's a new station in life, and it comes with new responsibilities, new blessings. And in a sense, no, maybe the Essenes didn't see it this way, but
right. No, it's a good analogy. How about lease to own? You say, I'm going to lease this for so many years, and after that, all that money that I'm putting in is actually going towards this as being mine. But that implies that you're actually good for your money, and you're actually going to stay current, and you're not going to fall behind on your payments and all of that. So there's a special arrangement. And so what happens is your contract matures at a certain point. And so Hashem makes a covenant with Israel, but he says at a certain point you will reach a moment of maturity where the certain clause of a contract will start affecting things. That clause is the Brit Chadashah. That clause is the new covenant. He says, I will make a different kind of a arrangement with you, the kind of arrangement that I did not make with your forefathers when I stood with them. He says, this is going to be a different kind of arrangement. It's based on something else. And so, of course, we read in Jeremiah, I'm going to put my laws in your heart and things like that. So things are a little bit different there. There's an internalization of walking with God in that new covenant Jeremiah speaks about that doesn't seem to exist at Sinai. There's some of that, but that internalization does not fully kick in Israel because a lot of people continue to sort of say externally obey and comply, but it is our hearts that Hashem wants to change. And so this is that change that we're talking about. Entering into a new covenant would be enter into that way of life, that mode of thinking and living.
Is this a phasing into the Messianic era? Like the new, is that what they were looking forward to?
Absolutely. That's so it's all tied to that. So why would people believe that the coming of the Messiah and the new covenant coincide? Well, because these are major transformations in society. In order for society to get a push, a kick in the right direction, something has to change, something has to happen, right? And so, of course, the coming of the Messiah is seen a lot of times as that something. The only thing that we disagree upon is whether that something is going to change and then Messiah comes, or then Messiah comes and then the change occurs. Like, we don't always know about the order of things, but we know that they somehow coincide together.
And as believers in Yeshua, of course, we recognize that the signing of the contract, so to speak, is in blood, and it's in the blood of the Messiah. So in that sense, they had a missing piece. But maybe they recognized the foreshadowing, right?
We could talk about the pieces that they had, because you'd be surprised. There's some pieces they had that I might surprise you on still.
So the Essenes that believed in the Mashiach coming and the Messianic era and all that.
Of course
like
they
the
did.
rest of it. Okay.
Like all Jews.
Yeah.
Like all Jews. They had some quirky, unique ideas about the Messiah that I'm going to share with you, because this is the section that I'm really tying a lot to the New Covenant, and the apostolic writings here quite a bit. So this is what I want you to think about. So it goes a little bit more. I'm going to read a little bit more from the Damascus document. So are all the men who entered into the new covenant in the land of Damascus. So you see, they keep talking about entering into the new covenant. For them, this is something very real, very tangible. And it has to do with their movement, by the way, because they're the ones who figured this out. Okay? And yet turned backward and acted treacherously and departed from the spring of living waters. Sounds familiar? For they spoke error against the statutes of righteousness and rejected the covenant and the pledge of faith, which they had affirmed in the land of Damascus. Again, there's that place of exile that they chose to exile themselves to. And this is the new covenant. And there shall be not be unto them, nor unto their families, a share in the house of Torah. So these people are very serious about this concept of new covenant, this idea that you are entering into it. This is a pledge, this is a promise, this is a commitment, and you don't go back, but yet they're lamenting that there are some people who basically back off. They backslide. They exit the promises that they've made, the commitments they've made, the pledges they made, and they basically say these people will not have a share in the house of Torah. They're excluded from the community. Why? Because they went back on their oaths and their promises. The Essenes were very famously known for not making promises lightly. If anyone made an oath or a promise or swore, that was probably one of the most important things, and you were to keep that oath at all costs whatsoever, which of course that's the teaching in the Torah. Any oath you make, you are obligated to keep, because you're making them not just to yourself or to other people, you're making them in front of Hashem. And so these people believed that they have entered into a new covenant, and that new covenant required a certain way of life, a certain commitment, a certain change in them, and then they were to stay in that way of life in order for that new covenant to spread, really. And that reality was going to have to spread. So we operate with these ideas like new covenant and kingdom, and so there are these big catch-all ideas that sometimes we don't fully comprehend. And so this new covenant is one of those such terms. But you could see in the Damascus document, the Essenes are using this term operatively all the time, as much as people in the apostolic writings. Yes.
Were they using this term New Covenant before the temple was destroyed, when they had left Jerusalem?
Yes. This predates the New Testament.
Predates.
This language predates the New Testament.
And it's in capital
No, there's no capitals in Hebrew.
This should be.
Yeah, I mean, there's no capitals. Everything is the same size. Everything is in capitals because it's one size letters on everything. So it's a language that doesn't have this. Like you cannot differentiate pronouns. People are like, oh, God should always be in capital pronouns, like he, him, his. I'm like, in Hebrew, it's all the same size. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's like so. It's.
Were they taking it from Jeremiah? The verse.
Absolutely. They read the verses in Jeremiah, they read the promises, and they said, this is what God wants us to have. This is what we want to have. And they believed that they were entering that stage, that moment in history that God promised. They firmly believed it, which is why they lived the way they lived. The commitment that they've made was really staggering. These are a lot of sacrifices.
Were they around when John the Baptist began?
Probably, yeah, they probably were around. The community of the Essenes basically fell into complete disarray around the time of the First Jewish War, and so like around the destruction of the temple, and after that's basically we stop having any sort of context for them. After that, it's like it just goes dormant. So we assume that they perished and they were destroyed, like a lot of other Jews would have been, whether they were not a huge movement to begin with. Well, whatever happened to them is you don't seek their continuation, is what I'm trying to say, past that moment. Other movements continue. Other Jewish groups continue and actually develop further. But that one, it's just like disappears and stands still. So perhaps maybe some of their followers got absorbed into some other groups in some way or shape or form. But that's, as far as we know, that's when it happens. So the movement really takes on force in about 2nd century BCE, and it moves into the 1st century CE, and then it disappears. So a lot of their writings that we have are from 1st century BCE, like from the times of, before the days of Herod, let's put it that way. In the days when Hillel and Shammai lived, that's when their writings are. In the days of really the very emergence of the sages and the rabbinic movement, just the very budding of that, that's when a lot of their writings come from. So the language of entering the new covenant by the Essenes is really remarkable. It clearly means a lot to them. We don't fully comprehend it because we don't have everything, but no doubt they understood this new covenant as just Jeremiah 31 described it. It's a new stage in God's relationship with Israel. Increased knowledge of God, the forgiveness of sin, the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Remember, what do these scenes look for? They look for rebuilding of Jerusalem. They don't like the corrupt powers that are ruling Jerusalem right now, and that's what they hope to see. So, but as a final rebuilding, that will never have to be repeated. It's meant that the city first had to be destroyed. And there comes the apocalypse. Here comes the great war that every apocalyptic movement expects to happen. And so Jerusalem was full of corruption, ripe and ready for that corruption to be wiped clean. Because when something is polluted and dirty, you would expect for God to come and clean that house. And that's what happened. So Yeshua himself lamented and cried over Jerusalem, predicting her ruin in the Gospels. Do you remember that? He says, "Oh, Jerusalem." Is that not the same sentiment of the idea that Jerusalem is corrupt and it is about to be destroyed? Because God is going to clean house. He wants to reclaim his holy place. So that's their hope. So here's a passage that I want you to read together with me. This is 4Q174. It's a midrash on 2 Samuel and on Psalms. And it's an important part because, of course, in 2 Samuel is where we read the prediction of the Davidic kingdom. So it has to do with Messiah there. And so the Qumran Jews saw themselves as a pure human sanctuary, a holy temple, Beit Mikdash, made up of people. How about that? Look at this quote. They write, "And strangers, we no longer destroy it." By it, they mean the temple. "As they previously destroyed the sanctuary of Israel because of its sins." So we know the temples were destroyed because the people were sinful. "He commanded that a sanctuary of men, Mikdash Adam, be built for himself in order to offer up to him, like the smoke of incense, the works of the law, and according to his words to David." So analyze this passage just for a second. This is their explanation that the strangers, the outsiders, the foreigners would come and destroy the temple, but God said, this is not going to happen anymore because the kind of temple that I'm going to build, you can't destroy. It's a sanctuary made out of people, a holy place made out of people. And they are going to offer offerings to him, like the smoke of the incense. And they're going to offer the works of the Lord. So they're going to actually follow the Torah, and their following of the Torah will be like the sacrifices before God. That's how God is going to see it. He's going to take it as worship. And all of that is according to the words of David. And they're going to, of course, cite passages from 2 Samuel and promises that were given to David. So this is a little bit of a midrash, right? But it is a midrash on a biblical text. And because we know what that biblical text is all about, we kind of get the idea that they are talking about themselves. They are. Their community in Qumran is the temple made of human beings.
So they would be interpreting the measurements of the new temple that are laid out. And it's so big and the city is so big that was all concerning that people all over the world, that the temple would have no limits in a way.
Right.
So a lot of people now are disturbed by the idea of a third temple being built because, first of all, they're concerned about sacrifices coming back, or they take the words of Peter who talks about us being stones built in a temple not made by hands, that it should be a more spiritually realized thing and not a real thing. These guys saw it as a real way of living, but still a spiritual
Absolutely.
thing.
And they did it before Peter did it.
Right.
That's what I want you to understand. A lot of times people think that these ideas are brand new, never heard before, absolutely original. This type of Jewish spirituality existed before. Now, how do we know it? By excavating the Dead Sea Scrolls and by looking at these passages and translating them and understanding what in the world they're talking about. It takes study, okay? It takes devotion. That's why study is worship. You get the idea of what I was talking about. So coincidentally, the early followers of Jesus, of course, saw their own community corporately as if a temple made out of humans as well. Right? So in Ephesians 2, for example, a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you're also being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. You heard that one. You read that one, right? Obviously, you realize the teaching in Ephesians is not saying that you are an actual temple. He says, as a community, as a group of people devoted together to Hashem, you are as if you were a temple. Not that you are a temple, not that you replace the temple, not that you can displace the temple either. But you are like a temple. You can function in a temple-like capacity. It was basically a living sanctuary that moved with them because God dwelt with them, and wherever they went is where God's presence went. And so that reality of offering sacrifices never left. Why do we stand here today and pray? After we read the Torah, we pray the Musaf service. Because the Musaf service, actually, that Amidah, coincides to the Olah, which was brought on Shabbat in Jerusalem. The additional offering was called Musaf. God said, today, because this is Shabbat, you bring me not just 2 lambs that you bring me every single day, but on Shabbat you bring 2 more lambs. And so we say this Musaf service because we are saying our words are like those sacrifices. And yes, the temple service continues. In the Jewish prayer book, it's built completely and entirely on replicating the temple service and emulating it and continuing it essentially in our days, wherever we are. Wherever there is a minyan, wherever there is a group of people who pray together this way, there he is. It's a living sanctuary, essentially, outside of the, Zion. So this is not a new idea, is what I want you to see. So the Essenes believed that God's judgment was fast approaching. Of course, we know that Yeshua, he grew indignant over the temple corruption and expelled those who engaged in commerce so close to the altar. Remember that incident? He was really upset about the corruption in the temple too. Qumranites likewise expected for God to cleanse the temple in Jerusalem of all wickedness, and their writings revealed that they believed that the end-time war between the forces of God, who some people understand sons of light like that, which would conceivably be themselves, sons of light, and Belial, Satan. And the apostolic writings contain very similar language, calling believers in Messiah sons of light. Have you encountered that? Where he says, you are the sons of light, right? Well, wherever there's sons of light, there's got to be sons of darkness. There's always that dichotomy, right? So guess what? The Essenes believed in the sons of light and sons of darkness, thinking that they are the sons of light, by the way. That's how they saw themselves. So here's a famous scroll. It's called the War Scroll. It's 1QM. The first attack of the sons of light shall be undertaken against the forces of the sons of darkness. The army of Belial. Belial, by the way, is another name for Satan, okay? It's the alternation of Baal, okay? And there shall be no survivors of the sons of darkness. Then, at the time appointed by God, his great excellence shall shine for all the times of eternity, for peace and blessing, glory, joy, and long life for all sons of light. It's the apocalyptic war, right? This is the end times that they're describing. And this is not a biblical scroll. This is their own writing, okay? So this describes this war in which the sons of light and the sons of darkness are in battle. And guess what? God wins. And the sons of light are on his side.
Would they have considered the rulers of the temple at that time sons of darkness?
Absolutely. You guessed it. That's who the sons of darkness are. I'm going to take you a little bit further even. I'm going to say this. And there's a fascinating interpretation put together by Professor Rachel Elior of the Hebrew University. She teaches at Hebrew University still, I believe. She's actually the head of the Department of Jewish Mysticism and Philosophy. And so she believes that the sons of light and the sons of darkness are special terms used in Qumran to refer to groups who follow the solar calendar versus those who follow the lunar calendar. How about that? We know that the Essenes left Jerusalem and the temple worship due to their disagreement over the calendar. They could not stand the fact that people who were running the temple, the Sadducees, incorporated the lunar calendar 100%. So the Essenes had this very interesting combination of solar and lunar calendar blended together. They believed that the seasons are to be discerned by the sun, but certain dates are to be discerned by the moon. So they kind of blended the two together. And so if they are the sons of light, it's because they follow the calendar based on light. But others are the sons of darkness because they want to follow the calendar based on the moon, which happens in the moment of darkness. So do you see the beautiful idiomatic way of calling people names, essentially? That's what we're talking about. We're discussing name calling among the Jews, right? I mean, come on. John the Baptist did it. Yeshua did it. He called people names too. These guys did it too. A while ago, if you remember, I did lecture on the Qumran community, and I talked about how they really disliked the Pharisees, and they had special names for them as well. They called them the makers of smooth ways. That's what they call them. They call them the smooth guys, the slick guys. Essentially, that's yeah. The ones who make the path smooth and easy. That's what they called them. And so that was their code word for the Pharisees. So it's a fascinating research by Rachel Elior, who's really a great scholar of Jewish mysticism in general. She specializes in the Hasidic movement, but she delved into the calendaric issues and jumped into the Qumran documents, and that was her explanation. I find it absolutely fascinating. I don't know if it's true, but I think it's worth considering because the code words that they use are really, really interesting.
Peter,
Yes.
I didn't understand the connection with the last part there where it says, many believe the book of Jubilees to be a book produced by this school of thought in Israel.
Have you read the book of Jubilees?
Yes, some of it, yes.
So if you read the book of Jubilees, you realize that the book of Jubilees represents a calendaric account of the times. It really is like a paraphrase of Genesis, and it just goes through the Torah. But then it also explains to you that the times are to be calculated based on the sun. So it actually teaches you the calendar that Essenes would have embraced. And so many people believe that their school of thought is the ones who produce the book of Jubilees. And in fact, they found quite a few copies of the book of Jubilees in the Qumran collection, which we know that they were very fond of, because it's the books that you read a lot are the ones that you have a lot of copies of, right? So it's understandable. If you value it and you study it, then you're going to have multiple copies in your library. And they did find quite a few copies of that book. They were very fond of it. So Jubilees presents a non-mainstream, if you consider like the Pharisaic, Sadduceic ideas as mainstream, that would be a non-mainstream view. So which is why people like Pharisees wouldn't have nothing to do with the book of Jubilees, because it doesn't support their views, really, because it's written by other Jews who think otherwise. So that's what that statement about. So I have another quote here for you to make you think, because my job here is to make you think all the time, nonstop. I want you to worship through study, okay? That's my job. So there's on one occasion Yeshua made a very curious promise to his disciples. He says, I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may be with you forever. That is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it does not see him or know him, but you know him, because he abides with you and will be in you. So hopefully that's a familiar passage, right? So you know this one. So he calls this Spirit another helper. So when you read these verses, you come to a logical conclusion. The English text translates alon parakleton as another helper or another counselor or another comforter, by the way. That's what parakletos means, a comforter of sorts. A difficult word to translate into English, doesn't really translate straightforward. But that word makes this verse a little harder to understand, because the adjective alos means another. So if I'm sending another helper, it implies, well, who is the first helper? If there's another comforter that is being sent to you, well, who is the comforter who's here? Or was there a comforter before? Because you can't have another without the primary one. Okay? So that's the question. And if that is Yeshua himself, then why would he use such a curious phrasing and kind of go in this circuitous way? Why can't you just say it straightforward? Why does he have to refer to himself and by such an interesting term? I mean, that's how people understand this verse. But I wanted to share another research with you. This is done by another professor in Israel, Professor Israel Knoll. Just like other ancient Jews, the Essenes firmly believed in the coming of the Messiah. But some of them thought that he was one of their leaders, whom they called the teacher of righteousness. That's how they titled their Messiah. And Menachem the Essene was believed to be the messianic figure for them. Menachem the Essene lived in the days of Herod the Great. He was one of the great Essenes to whom they refer to as the teacher of righteousness. He was a priest. Now, based on some hymns found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Professor Israel Knoll at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem argued that one generation before Yeshua, another messianic leader arose who became known as the teacher of righteousness, and that was Menachem the Essene, the advisor to the court of King Herod himself. You may have never heard about Menachem the Essene, but actually Professor Knoll wrote a fascinating book. You may not agree with much of what he said, but it is fascinating just for the fun of reading it. It's called Messiah Before Jesus. And where he explains this theory quite a bit. And he has good evidence. He's basing it on the Dead Sea Scrolls, on the original texts, the materials that he studied. So if you don't know, Menachem led a very dangerous life because he was secretly preparing for what eventually proved to be an unsuccessful revolt. He's one of the advisors to Herod. And the whole time he's thinking about making a coup and a revolution. And his followers believed that he was the Messiah, but he was disgraced and killed by Roman soldiers during the revolt in the year 4 BCE. So just before Herod dies, just before Yeshua is born, like at that very moment, that's when Menachem the Essene perishes. He has a failed attempt at the revolution, and he dies, and the Romans put him to death. So the Messiah failed. Okay? So according to Knoll, the Essenes later reinterpreted his life as the fulfillment of the suffering servant text in Isaiah. They went straight to Isaiah 53 and said, this is about our Menachem. Now, the theory is that the Hebrew word that stands behind this above-mentioned Greek term, parakletos. Parakletos means comforter, person who brings you comfort. Guess what Menachem means? Same thing. Somebody who brings you comfort. That's what that word means. Comforter. The one who brings you comfort, consolation, right? That's what that word means. So they kind of expected Messiah to have a name like that. So now think about Yeshua saying those words in John, that I'm sending another comforter. Okay? Could he have been speaking of a comforter? Could he have been speaking to Essenes, perhaps? Think about it for a second. When he referred to the coming of the Spirit by another comforter, was he identifying himself as the first and true Menachem, the comforter of Israel? Or perhaps he was appealing to the Essenes to put their trust in him? We don't know. The truth is, there's code language in the Gospels. And unless you understand that these are internal terms that these communities are using, and that these terms have a very specific meaning to them, they have very generic meaning to us, but they have very specific meanings to them. If I'm speaking to the inside crowd, I can use certain lingo and they know exactly what that means, while everyone else in the room is left wondering, what in the world did he say? Could it be possible that Yeshua is speaking to the Essenes through a statement like that would get preserved in the gospel?
Two observations, not related. One, Yeshua is certainly a type of Noah, in the sense, the ark, and Noah's name means comfort.
Noah.
Right?
Same root.
Yeah, and so the other point, I guess, is a broader point. Sometimes I observe when secular academics and scholars are looking at biblical truths, like, so for example, the Brit Hadashah, and they might look at this and say, see, therefore the messianic claims of Yeshua are derivative of this, and therefore it's a dismissive, way of saying, I see. It's kind of like the virgin birth idea. Well, we find things of that in pagan myth, right? So therefore, they just copied it. Like, the other side of that coin, of course, is that, well, actually, what we believe is that these describe realities. And in a sense, if somebody else saw it from a distance, like I see that podium, nevertheless, your hands are on it and you're closer, you have a much, more accurate
I actually
view.
know what's laying on this podium.
Exactly, exactly.
Because you can't see this.
So we would say as Yeshua is the guy at the podium.
Right. No, good point, good point. You're excellent, yes.
When you understand what was leading up to Jesus' time, what was in the thoughts of the people who were concerned about Israel and the promises that had been made. When you hear the words of the two traveling to Emmaus, and it's that we had hoped he was the one.
Yes.
You feel their disappointment even more
Right.
knowing this. And Jesus says, let me tell you about something you don't understand. So that's when it turned and he said, I am the one, but it doesn't look like what you thought.
Exactly. So I am the one, but not the kind of one that you thought that one would be. So there's a little bit of that disappointment. Hopefully you can understand. I'm bringing this academic research basically from Hebrew University, and these people who are wondering along these lines and doing really cutting edge research. That's something that nobody has up until this point has researched. And they're bringing in new facets of us to try to understand that which we have wondered about before. And maybe we got it, maybe we don't.
Question for you. You're asking a question because when Jesus, Yeshua, referred to the coming Holy
Right.
Spirit as another Menachem, was he identifying himself? How would you reconcile that question with the statement he says, I will not leave you alone, but I will ask the Father, and he will send you another comforter. How would he be referring to himself in that scenario?
I'm just saying, the statement is cryptic. I mean, it's almost like Kabbalistic. It's like you realize that he's leaving the plain language behind by saying these kinds of things. So it could be understood in a variety of ways. And I think it's meant to be understood by the people who are listening, because they have the insight that we, 2,000 years from now, simply lack. Some of it could be for the fact that we just don't possess the same understanding of terminology that's being used in there. Some of it is context. There's something in there that we just cannot see. So we have a tradition that's preserved, a tradition that's true and right, but we don't fully grasp the gravity of what is being said, And that's what basically we're exploring. We're exploring a possibility that there's something there under the surface that we haven't seen, which is why me bringing the history of Menachem the Essene, and as we're discussing this interesting group. So hopefully it makes sense why I'm doing that. Now, I got one more for you, and then I'm going to wrap it up, I promise. Okay, you guys ready for another one? Some Essenes expected priestly Messiah, calling him the Messiah of Aaron, and I could show you that. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed that the Qumran Jews called their awaited Messiah Son of God. You can find that in 4Q246, and that use is absolutely striking. It's absolutely almost identical against Luke chapter 1, verses 31 to 33. I'm going to shove this to you, and you guys are going to be amazed that you think they were copying each other, okay? So this is 4Q246, called the Aramaic Apocalypse. So this particular scroll is written in Aramaic, and it's a little fragmentary, but it's actually quite good. So it says, affliction will come on earth. He will be called great. Son of God he will be called, and Son of the Most High they will call him. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. He will judge the earth in truth, and all will make peace. Sound familiar? It's like they're reciting the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah, right? Just a little rehashing. But interestingly, that as they speak of the Messiah, and we know they're speaking about Messiah, they call him great, Son of God, Son of the Most High. That is how they say the Messiah will be understood. That's how they expect him. So now Luke 1:31 through 33. And you shall name him Jesus, Yeshua. He will be great. Great? Great. Right? He will be called the Son of the Most High. Son of the Most High. How about that? And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. How about that for a promise? This is the words of the angel spoken about Yeshua. This is what you name him, and this is what he will be. And this right here is the expectation in the 4Q246. Do you see how strikingly similar they are? So when I say that Jews in the first century of Common Era, some Jews, not all Jews, but these ones for sure, believe that Messiah will be the Son of the Most High, they meant it. So when Yeshua comes on the scene and he's proclaimed and hailed as the Son of the Most High, those same Jews are going to say, yay!
He's here.
That's exactly what we've been expecting for. That's what we've been waiting for. That's what we know is supposed to happen. So there it is.
But Yeshua aligned himself more with the Pharisees, so then is that part of why Essenes, because there is a group of people out there that actually believe that Yeshua is more in line with the Essenes, and now as you've been presenting all this,
Right.
I'm like, I'm seeing how they're seeing these connections, and they're saying, we're on the wrong calendar, we need to be doing the calendars that the Essenes are doing, and all of that, so, you know, and then with John the Baptist kind of being
The issue is
connected.
complicated.
Yes.
The issue is very complicated. What I want to show you through our study of ancient Jewish movements, through the diversity, is that at sometimes Yeshua aligns himself with Pharisees. Halachically, he is with them. Sometimes he is with Bet Hillel, sometimes with Beit Shammai. Most of the time he is with Hillel. On some issues, he aligns with the Essenes. He's stricter. He calls for greater righteousness. He says if your righteousness does not surpass the righteousness of these people, meaning these people, if you think they're righteous, they're not really righteous. There's a greater way, a better way to live for God. So you get the idea. He actually has his own theology. Okay? I know everybody wants to own him. Everybody wants to say, oh, he's the Pharisee. Oh, he's this. He's the Essene. No, he has his own take on things. But there's a lot of overlap. And it is this overlap that I'm exploring with you because I want you to see that what he comes and teaches is a conglomeration of many different things. And he appeals to all these groups in their own unique individual ways. But he has his own agenda, so to say, that he wants to. He has his own Torah. He has his own Mishnah that he wants to teach to his disciples.
He knows what he needs to say to his audience.
Yes.
To explain who he is.
Absolutely.
And how he's set apart.
He speaks their language. He speaks their language, which is what you would expect.
Quick question, do you know of any instances where his theology overlaps with that of the Sadducees?
We know very little about the theology of Sadducees. This is the problem. So as I did the session on the Sadducees, I tried to explain that we just have tiny bits and pieces on most of it as kind of caricatures. So we don't really know a lot of what they believed. And because Sadducees were a priestly group primarily concerned with priestly things, it's like we don't always get the halachic things. But, you know, they were like sola scriptura guys. They were really literal about plain pshat type interpretation of every verse in the Bible, essentially. So you don't see Yeshua doing that, by the way. Sometimes he goes for straight pshat, and then other times he takes that passage and takes off and flies into the stratosphere. You know that. You know he does that. And same thing with Shaul, and same times there is. So you don't see a lot of that literalism, you know, that you would see with Sadducees most of the time. So I don't know any. Yes, Jeremy.
To illustrate your point further, you know, Yeshua is not derivative of any school of thought, right? So if he is who he claims to be, if he is the eternal God, you know, if he is the Son of God, then in a sense, in a very real sense, all the schools of thought that came before him, to the degree that they received the truth, they were just seeing one facet of a very beautiful diamond, right? Now maybe we get to see the whole diamond now.
That's
But,
the idea.
You know.
That's the idea. Everyone has little bits, pieces of truth that reveal the Messiah. And I want you to appreciate the beauty of what the Essenes thought the Messiah would be, and what the Pharisees would think a Messiah would be, or Sadducees who wouldn't care for Messiah because they don't really need one. So things like that. There are other Jewish movements. You know, we're going to talk about Zealots. We're going to talk about Herodians. We still yet to study Pharisees. You know, and they all have very unique ideas and beliefs about this, and they all have these little bits and pieces of truth. And I think as Yeshua comes to the scene, he's trying to speak to all of them. But we don't always get it because we don't know where they come from. We know so little of their world. So this is the whole point of my study, is basically to study their world with you so that you can start entering into that context. Okay? So anyway, have fun, enjoy. This is it. My time has run out.